Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. Let's get started. Hi guys and welcome back. I am your host Tia Harmer and today I am joined by Benjamin Shields, an experienced clinical psychologist with over 15 years experience. In today's episode we are talking about boundary management and how it affects our personal resilience. So let's get started. Hi Ben, how are you?
Very good, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yes, very nice. Thank you so much for being here. So let's talk about your career. You're a psychologist. You've been a psychologist for over 15 years, which is a really long time. For those who don't know you, do you mind explaining a bit about who you are and what it is you do?
Sure. Yeah. I've been a psychologist for most of my career. But I really love my work.
That's
it's
good.
It's good. There's always new things to kind of learn about it, new layers to it. A lot of new research that comes out about it. So it's very stimulating. I have my own practice in Melbourne. Some great workmates as well. So we kind of have a really good working relationships there. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, before we started the recording, you said you're from Sydney, but then you just said you have a practice in Melbourne. We need some clarification here because we are in Melbourne. Where are you?
I'm in Melbourne.
Okay.
I was born in Sydney and moved to Melbourne about 6 years ago.
Oh, nice. Why the switch? I love Sydney. Why'd you come here?
I love Sydney as well. But, you know, when you kind of get to know every street and you know everything about the city, it's there's something good about being in a place where, you know, you're looking around and still seeing new things. And I wanted to change, and it was kind of, Melbourne is super charming and yeah.
It certainly is. Oh, awesome. So how did you end up in your profession as a psychologist? Because it's not niche, but it's also something that you have to have a passion for to do it. So what made you go, yeah, this is what I'm going to do for literally my whole existence?
I remember as a child thinking about, you know, career as you do or what you want to do. Maybe working with animals for a bit, but I thought that's probably going to be pretty sad on a lot of days.
So you chose human psychology. Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, there is that. But the idea of being able to do something that's very directly associated with people, you know, there's not too many layers away from the person or doing something kind of constructive or positive. So I like the directness about that, like when I conceptualized that as a kid. And it's turned out really to be that. So you have like really intimate relationships with your clients and it's you're able to, it is heavy content a lot of the time, like difficult, but you know, being able to get in there and sort of help them to transform some often horrific experiences is a really, really good feeling.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. And what would you say is your sort of favorite area or your area of expertise or specialization?
Yeah, I guess those things sort of change over time. Like most psychologists, you have like you come out of uni, and it's all really about sort of the model that you were taught with. So for me, it's like a clinical psychology, abnormal psychology sort of model, diagnostic model. And then you realize that there's a whole lot of other stuff, a whole lot of other lenses to look through, like other people and different ways to view things, and yourself as well, through the same types of lenses. And over time that I've moved through a variety of different sort of focuses, but now I sort of have started to work in a way related to brain networks and how they are associated with sense of self, and how those how they can be disrupted in due to different experiences. So trauma, early trauma, how our experiences shape how we see ourselves, and how to deal with that from a bottom-up perspective by factoring in the nervous system and how the mind and brain interact. That's kind of my thing now.
Yeah, cool. Oh, great. Well, thank you for answering those questions. So I'm going to pepper Ben with more questions now, where we're going to get to know him on a little bit more of a personal basis that isn't related to the topic. So let's talk about books. Are you a reader? That's the key question here.
I mean, unfortunately, it's kind of about the same topic because all I read is psychology books.
Yeah.
You know, when you're doing a PhD as well, like there's so much reading required with papers and stuff like that. So, but I find it really interesting as well. So a lot of those things are sort of, you know, the key different concepts and stuff like that. But there was a particular book when I was much younger, which was when I got out of uni, and a friend recommended, and it's called Character Styles by Stephen Johnson. And in that book, he talks about how people have a different style in their character, and that was a sort of different sort of construct than you know, the clinical psychology models. My first introduction to a different lens on people, so that was something I'd always remember.
Yeah. What is character style? What does that mean? Or is that a really difficult question for you to answer?
I'll try to keep the answer pretty tight. So, like for example, like people talk about narcissism, you know, and it's a lot in media and in the popular culture now, being a narcissist, organizations being narcissistic and so on. But the idea of having a particular style that might be narcissistic, that's not, you know, that doesn't make us a narcissist per se, but it's a narcissistic one, or a dependent style, you know, in relationships. Or a symbiotic sort of style, where sort of the differentiation between us in relationships is kind of more perforated, you know. So these sorts of concepts that allow people not to be in a particular category, they allow us to sort of explore those concepts where they came from, for people that isn't overly pathologizing, is more respectful.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right. Let's talk about movies.
Yeah.
Are you a movie or TV person, or both?
I mean, my partner always wants me to watch like things that are going to make me cry, and I don't want to cry on the weekend. Do you know what I mean? So
no,
I think I have a pretty specific sense of humor as well. So I tend to more like scary movies. I like, you know, things that are
you lost me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Really
interesting. All right. What is a movie you would recommend?
Maybe I would recommend. It's hard when you kind of like scary movies because most of them are pretty, you know, 6 out of 10. So there's a couple of jump scares and then you forget the whole thing because it follows a very similar format, and you just keep doing it over and over again. So there's not too many that I would recommend in that way.
Okay, fair enough. All right, let's talk about famous role models. Now, obviously, some people have them, some people don't. Some people have personal role models. Do you have a famous role model?
Not really. I mean, my role models have really been more related to my field.
Yeah.
You know, people who've sort of done really interesting stuff that might have shifted how we see things, and that becomes embedded in all of our work. So
yeah,
probably less fun and interesting, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, but you can tell us some.
I mean, they're different sort of. Ruth Lanius is one. She does a lot of research on sense of self and trauma.
Yeah, right.
She's one of many, but
Right. Okay.
they're really prolific in terms of research and diving into a lot of detail about how things kind of work in the nervous system, and it's sort of informing like a more of a biological sort of way of looking at things, which is good.
Yeah. I love it. That's great. All right. And podcasts. First, do you actually listen to podcasts? I won't be insulted if you don't.
Well, these podcasts that you're doing, this really been the first podcast that I have watched, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, did you watch some of my podcasts?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I just like, I can't watch or listen to myself. Like, it's the bane of my existence, is actually like watching and listening to my own self.
It's a self-critic scenario.
But yeah, so you like more like science educational sort of based podcasts?
I mean, the closest thing I get to podcasts is like listening to books in my car. So
right. So you're not exactly a podcast person.
No, not really.
Not really.
But I am now.
Fair enough. Okay, great. Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, look, some people are, some people aren't. It's really, up to the person. And there are a lot of different types of podcasts. Like I sort of like since becoming the host of this show, I do not listen to this type of show only because I am like hosting it. So I learn everything that I want to learn like on the spot, which is awesome because if I didn't, then obviously I would go and I would listen to this podcast. So when I am listening to podcasts, I listen to more like funny, just like fun conversational, just sort of like feels like I'm hanging out with friends. Yeah, just like really relaxed sort of podcasts that usually are very not educational. Just sort
That's probably the idea though, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just sort of, girls hanging around talking about stupid stuff and all that kind of, all those things, which I love.
Sounds personal.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's talk about courses. Now that's a very broad word. So I'm giving you a lot to work with here. So I'm going to ask you sort of what is a course you have recently completed?
Course I've recently completed. Well, I'm kind of I'm probably half or 2/3 way through my PhD, which is probably like the mother of all courses that I've been involved in.
Yeah.
But I'm still kind of wrestling with that one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Well, I hope that ends well. My best friend just did hers, and it was a trip watching her do that just as a bystander. She's taken off to the UK now for 8 months just to like go do nothing, which is great. Yeah, I'm like, oh, that's fair enough. But anyway, all right. Well, thank you for answering those questions. But we're now going to get down to the nitty-gritty stuff. So obviously, as I mentioned, we're here today to talk about boundary management and how it's connected to our personal resilience, which is the overarching theme of this show. But for our listeners, Ben, how would you define personal resilience?
For personal resilience is really comes down to adaptation, like being able to adapt to change.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's it's something that never stops, of course, because everything is always changing, even when it's not.
That's a great insight.
Even when it's not, the thing that can change is you can become bored, or things can become repetitive. So
you can change. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's kind of impossible to do without that.
Exactly. Yeah, no, 100%. And I think resilience, I've heard lots of different definitions, over doing this every week for a very long time. And yeah, I hear a lot of different definitions, but it is about being sort of multifaceted and bendable and, bouncing back is the name of this show, which is the whole point.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, you
exactly.
can sort of look at like structures in nature as well. There's different strategies about how to withstand force, and some of them are about being very rigid, and others are about sort of being able to absorb things and flex. And if your strategy is the first one to stay rigid, then I mean you have to stay very rigid because
we wish you the best of luck.
Well, exactly. And I guess we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So
exactly. Yeah, we're going to delve into that a little bit more. But a lot of people think that resilience means being immune to stresses and adversity and sort of being, just kind of invincible and maybe a bit numb. What do you think about this? Why do you think people have this misconception?
I mean, some of these models are old, about old models about stoicism and what it means to be strong.
Yeah.
That would have us associate strength with not showing any emotion or distress about things. Behind the scenes, it's a lot more complicated than that, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
So,
Yeah, definitely. It is. Yeah, I think there are a lot of misconceptions that, like you said, are based off those old school sort of thought processes and all that kind of stuff in terms of, being strong and being stoic and being numb is a desirable trait because it sort of makes you invincible. And I think obviously, that comes from years of things that, our generation has never been through in terms of, world wars and all that kind of stuff. And they can become, unhealthy coping mechanisms. But that is not what resilience is at the end of the day. It is not about being numb. It's not about being immune. It is about, in fact, being flexible and being able to bounce back. So let's go into boundary management. Now, I heard this word and you hear a lot about boundaries and sort of being able to say no, and it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. But in your personal sort of professional experience, how would you define boundary management?
That's a term that is kind of used in a lot of different contexts, from workplaces to intimate relationships and all sorts of things. But really, it's about having a limit or an edge to you, and how that interacts with somebody else. So, I mean, we can think about that as being like a Venn diagram that sort of intersects, and that boundary is something that might not be completely rigid. It's it's more of like a double fence that you and your neighbor sort of both maintain, and if you make sure yours is maintained, and that your cows don't go over onto your neighbor's yard, and vice versa. But one of the things around boundary management, because I think a lot of the material that we encounter in this subject area is about how to protect yourself from others in terms of maintaining boundaries. But boundary management is something that sort of works in both directions. We manage our own boundaries for our relationships that we're in as well. So,
like managing our internal boundaries?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of, you can look at that from a variety of different angles, in the sense that if we don't necessarily have great boundaries within ourselves, we sort of are then by default reliant on the other person's boundaries. Because, which is, the risks associated with that sort of configuration are less if you sort of, the people in your life or the person in your life has is very empathetic and is concerned for you and those sorts of things. But as we know, that's not always the case with everyone we encounter. So, But on the other side, it's we being able to acknowledge sort of what's your stuff, what are your emotions, and how they impact others.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And having insight into like our role in different sort of patterns in relationships. That's boundary management as well.
Yeah, great. So how does boundary management and all that stuff that you just mentioned, how does this affect our personal resilience? How does that tie in?
Boundary management and resilience. There are, in terms of what we might say, like problems associated with having poor boundaries which is sort of a gross term, having poor boundaries or whatever that means. Yeah. But if we think about what that means for the person, it can be quite stressful to be sort of stuck in that space. I mean, worrying about what others might think of us in terms of being able to express what we need or saying no, for example, that can take up a lot of energy to worry about the consequences on the relationships. We might develop other strategies that can actually lead us to avoiding other people or keeping other people at arm's length as well. So long term, that can mean that we have sort of less support around us as well. Those things that we might draw from, when we meet a challenge in life, sort of social support. But also there's to have good boundaries is easier when you have a fairly strong sense of who you are and sense of self. So it goes the other way in the sense that sense of self is also a core component in resilience.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really core component. And I think I've spoken about this on, a lot of different episodes in terms of being able to understand yourself. And that really is at the core of like a lot of these concepts, is being able to have like a strong sense of self and understanding who you are and sort of where your boundaries are and where your morals lie and your values and all that kind of stuff. And that is something that is difficult to develop, no matter how crucial it is to our lives. It's something that, tends to only come when you're older and you've experienced things. But you mentioned before sort of like different types of boundaries. Can you expand on this a little bit in terms of what are the various personal boundaries and what does that mean?
Sure. I mean, boundaries relates to the like our personal space, like around us, and how we interact with others in that sense. How much time we give to other people, and how much time we sort of they give to us. How much we allow others to influence us, our behaviors and ideas about ourselves and the world. In intimate relationships, boundaries play a really important role, of course, like knowing what feels right for us and being able to communicate that. How much to expect others to accommodate of us and how much we're prepared to accommodate of other people in terms of, strain on relationships, or how much we give and for how long, those sorts of things. So it's, it can be complicated to really define what those things are in a real life kind of way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say there's sort of, we kind of have like those 3 or 4 sort of key boundaries in terms of boundaries with like our workplace, our family, and like our intimate relationships?
Yeah, like life domains. Yeah. You can put it through that lens. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So let's talk about learning to say no and what these boundaries are, because we hear most of the time about sort of learning to say no is like that biggest boundary in terms of, people pleasing personalities and all that kind of thing. How important is it to learn to say no, and how should we know when to say yes instead?
Yeah, okay. It's a good question, I guess, because like learning how to say yes, sort of, I guess that is in response to maybe an idea that we would, it's hard to negotiate or to find out when to say yes and no to different things. But
Yeah, exactly.
In we in every close relationship, we're required to say no to things. Whether it's about what we feel like doing. If we're too tired to do something, or if someone asks us to see a band we don't really like.
Yeah.
These things, they're sort of embedded in the relationship, being able to express what we want to do and what we don't want to do. I think it's really difficult to get to know somebody if they never really said no, because it's kind of, that's how we can, that process helps us to define who the person is and what they like. So it's a process of yeses and nos in a broad sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely when you said sort of like it's important to learn what someone else says no to, because when they're just always a yes person, you're just like, well, where are your lines? Like,
Exactly.
what is it that you do and don't like? And I have had this problem before in just terms of being like, I've never seen you get angry or anything about anything. Like, it's just very frustrating because I'm like, well, where are your lines and where are your boundaries? So it is difficult for some people to say no, like we sort of said, when people don't say no, it is very difficult, obviously for that person, and difficult for the people around them to kind of learn about them on a different kind of level. Does that mean that that person is a people pleaser, or do they just have a pleasing personality? And is there a difference between the two?
Yeah, I think those things can be roughly differentiated. A lot of people really like being able to make other people happy, and they find a lot of joy in doing that, being there for others. Having a pleasing personality, as opposed to, I guess, at the extremes, what you might call a difficult personality, or someone says no to everything, or
yeah,
you know what I mean? I mean, these things are, they're polarized in this type of, through this sort of paradigm, but wanting to please others, and that might be on one side, but a people pleaser, in the sense we're sort of looking at, can come from a range of different, can have a range of different underpinnings for being sort of anxious about what might happen if there's disruption in the relationship, or if we say no.
Yeah.
Maybe fear of conflict, which can come from things in the past, or generally. It can be that we might not really know who we are if we're not trying to please others. Like, that idea in itself could feel really confusing if that's the part of us that we've come to associate with being who we are, or our kind of true self.
Yeah.
It can be, it can be hard to know any other type of way. Yeah. I think as well, it's the people pleaser. It can be that we might know that in a more ideal situation we would say no, or put some sort of boundary in place, but there's a sense, like a feeling of like a compulsion, like I feel pulled to do it, and that can create, like, there can be this observation of a conflict inside where part of me feels like I need to do it, but another part of me maybe feels frustrated, exhausted, maybe angry at the other part that keeps saying yes to things, resentful, like those sorts of feelings can all be in the mix. So I think that's more that second category.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. So is being, like, if you are a people pleaser, is this like a permanent thing, like a constant everyday thing, or can it be situational, or does that make it sort of just like, having like a little bit of a pleasing personality?
I mean, it depends what sort of environments we would encounter, right? If it's hard to say no, or I mean, there's one thing, I guess, if it's hard to say no, but the other thing is to constantly volunteer oneself to help others, that type of pattern. So those sort of patterns are going to be activated in different situations and environments, right? Like, so there might be a period in a person's life where those things don't seem to be creating as much of a problem, because there isn't, they are resourced enough so that that's sort of obscured, or they're with people who don't let them give too much,
Yeah.
It's like the manager that says, no, it's like 7:30 and you're still in the office, like go home and take an extra day off. Do you know what I mean? So that kind of is protecting that person from that becoming something that becomes like an exhaustion or burnout sort of factor.
Yeah. Interesting. So you mentioned before in terms of it can be something that develops because of experiences. Are there any specific experiences or events in a person's life that might contribute to the development of people-pleasing tendencies?
Definitely. We could sort of look at an example from like early development and development within a family system, for example. So if we picture a child in that sort of environment where certain behaviours are affirmed and encouraged, and others are sort of either not acknowledged or criticised, or there might be shame attached to them.
Yeah.
So in families, families being the first kind of orbit, and then there are others outside of that, like to do with society and culture, of course. But we can be the people-pleasing behaviours. They can be seen as really positive traits about people. You're always really helpful, always really caring, always giving to others. Being a selfless person who doesn't think about themselves. These sorts of things, they have positive associations attached to them. But in families, it can be that we learn that to be loved requires us to be a certain way. And as children, we can lean into that type of way of functioning without even realizing that. So there's energy invested into that. And in that sense, we can move away from a truer version of ourselves. It can feel harder to access in adulthood because there's been a lot of time spent in that other mode.
Yeah.
So that's one in terms of family, right? And that can be a big one that we work on, with people in therapy as well, looking at where that sort of conditioning comes from. And the other side of that is, of course, when people are learning to put different boundaries in and express what they need, how anxious they can feel, and the shame they experience about doing that.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the common challenges that people face, what would you say are like the biggest sort of difficulties that people with a pleasing personality sort of have to confront when it comes to boundary management?
I mean, it's a good question, and there's a really big range here because if we can't protect ourselves in that way, then we can be really vulnerable to all sorts of experiences, exploitation and abuse in relationships, for example, being some of those. Though that sort of area is kind of on one end.
Yeah.
It can be that we will burn out because being there for others all the time and not factoring in one's own needs. It's can be an exhaustion factor that can then kind of shift our ideas about what it feels like to be in close relationships, what friendship feels like. So that sort of narrative part around and belief part about ourselves in relationships can shift. Relationships can feel just too exhausting for me. I don't want to, it changes the orientation to them in that sense. Also, there's another aspect of it that involves sort of adaptation to the parts of us that always want to give. So I'll give you an example about what I mean with this one, because it's we sort of talked before about that there can be sort of conflict internally, like recognizing that there's a part that always wants to be there for somebody else or others.
Yeah.
and that it's there can be other parts of us as well that maybe don't agree with that, maybe feel resentful, maybe feel really confused and frustrated about those other parts. And so we can develop other adaptations on top of that to actually help us to get the boundary in place. And some of those things are they can require us to get quite angry, to put the boundary in as a way of counteracting the other part, in a sense. So some of the adaptations to, like, the people pleasing part can include things like avoiding close relationships, maybe lashing out because however heavy this part of us is, the other part has to be as strong to kind of counteract it in those sorts of moments. So we can develop more like global sort of views about relationships and ourselves that can then start to change our orientation to ourselves and other people. It can mean that there might be more ruptures in close relationships because we're not able to express what we need unless we do it in a certain way or feel angry enough.
Yeah, interesting. This is all like hitting a certain button in my head going, oh, this makes sense. Yeah, I am like, I don't know if I would be called, no, I think I would be a people pleaser. I think, it's a big part of me, which is very annoying, and I don't enjoy it, and I get very angry. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, there's those parts of us under normal conditions, in the most part of our lives, they might be parts of us that we really love as well, like being very empathetic, being genuinely interested in others' lives. Those parts of us, we don't want to pathologize those parts or say that is a problem. Wanting to please others because we care about them, we care about people, and we can really feel how they might feel or imagine that. Those things are really beautiful traits about people.
Yeah, no, definitely. But I want to go back to something that you mentioned before, because you spoke about sort of like the positivity of having some of these traits, and there can be like a good side in terms of having a healthy sort of pleasing personality, being nice. But you mentioned the term selfless and being a selfless person. Is there a difference in terms of like what those two terms mean, and having a pleasing personality or being a people pleaser and being a selfless person? Like, are they two different things or like way too similar?
People pleaser versus selfless.
Yeah.
I think like the association between would compare those terms. Like, selfless probably has a positive kind of association with it in terms of we're described as a selfless person. So, well, that's really beautiful. That's great. Being described as a people pleaser, that might sit less comfortably with us.
Yeah, it doesn't have that positive connotation.
You know what I mean? I think selfless is probably a term that we might not use as much anymore because it's kind of clunky in a way. Selfless, to not
definitely,
to not factor in your own needs, or to not think about oneself, like when you're giving to others. It sounds like a bit of a recipe for burnout.
Yeah, I feel like we hear more about the term being selfish now. And sometimes you've just got to be a bit selfish. I feel like we hear that definitely more than being selfless.
Well, that's a great point too, because like on one side we might have selfless, and then we might say, I'm being selfish here because I'm going to take some time out for myself. Which in a way, it might feel selfish to the people pleaser, but in another way, that's really about what resilience is, because it's registering that we need a break. Do you know what I mean? So it's not so much being selfish as being
no, definitely
resourceful and recognizing your own needs.
Yeah. What kind of advice do you have for people who struggle with that though? Because look, I have a very pleasing personality, and I will do things that I do not enjoy just to like, please another person. But then anytime, like, I try to put in a boundary or I say no, I get like this guilt where I'm just like, oh, like you should have done that. Like, maybe, you'd want someone to do that for you, or maybe they were really like maybe you're the only person who can do this and you didn't do it. And now that person is just really upset because you were like the last straw. What kind of advice do you have for someone like me who is like, you get that wave of guilt, like I get like that, like that mum guilt in terms of just being like, oh, like saying no or putting in a boundary where, I have to take time for myself to avoid burnout, but I feel bad about it. Like, how do you work your way out of that?
I mean, a couple of different factors here probably to consider. And one is like certain roles within relationships, which, for example, if we are, if we're in like a counselor or psychologist role in a friendship, and it seems that most of the friendship seems to have sort of coalesced around this role where one person is that for the other person, we might say, okay, well, this, the relationship has kind of either started that way or it's kind of shifted into this space where that doesn't necessarily feel like a friendship anymore. That's not the sort of the model of friendship that I want in my life. It can be that you mentioned that it may be that I'm the one person who can do this for that other person. And it may feel that way, right? But is it really true? I mean, what sort of things are in that category?
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, interesting.
But onto the guilt thing. I mean, should we talk about that?
Yeah. Like, and I guess that's sort of it. It goes into my next question. Like, how can people, like, how can you shed the guilt? Like, obviously, you need to be able to have an understanding of, like, when people really do and like need your support, and you have to sort of, you have to help people and be there for people, and sometimes you have to do things for the benefit of others, and that's good. Like, it's a good, healthy trait, being able to, have healthy boundaries and being able to say yes and compromise and all that kind of stuff. We hear about compromising and communication and all those kinds of things. And there are those it's a good thing. And that comes from, cultural and societal norms in terms of what is healthy and what is not. But like, how do you shed for the guilt thing? It's just really annoying. How do you how do you work through that? Is there a point where like someone, like, you can feel less guilty and just sort of been like, oh, I would have loved to have said yes, but I couldn't, so that's okay.
Okay, so I mean, we can sort of have a look at what guilt is for, in terms of not that emotions have a purpose, because they're sort of evolved, that they have a function in terms of how we interact with groups. And emotions like guilt and resentment they're social emotions. They involve interactions with other people. And you might look at, there's probably like a lane keeping aid in terms of our interactions with others and relationships, where on one side we have guilt and on the other side we have resentment. And we might think about those things as being like lanes on a road. And, if you're driving along and if you have one of those cars that sort of, it might steer you back in. If you go over the line, or some of them might beep, if you start crossing the line on one side and then on the other side. And we might, you're working within those parameters. For example, if we're continually giving in a friendship, for example, a relationship, what can happen over time is that we'll start to resent the other person and change how we feel about the relationship. It's like this relationship feels like a lot of work. especially if you're kind of not used to asking for help yourself. So, if you're a highly empathetic person, you can empathize with the other person in their situation. And, that part of you wants to help them because you're like, I would love for someone like me to help me in that situation. But it could be that's not so much of a two-way street. If it is, and you're comfortable doing that, then that might be a different experience. But back to the guilt and resentment thing is that we can use that as a guide in terms of how we're going to be in the relationship with boundaries, how to, you might imagine saying, like, a friend might ask you to do something. Say a friend asks you to help move. Can you help me move on the weekend? And you might think, I have moved so many times in my life, like I never want to move again. And I know if I do that, I'm going to feel really resentful about it.
Yeah.
And even saying that, I've had those parts too. And I'm thinking there's conflict there because I kind of want to help, but I know that if I do that, I'm not going to feel great about it. The vibe's going to change. So we might say, no, in that case, we might say, literally, I've moved so many times, like I don't want to do it again. I'm happy to help with some other things. Because there's a dilemma. If you do it, you might feel resentful and it might change how you feel about the relationship over time. Yeah. So you kind of get to choose from a terrible menu, which is on one side like either guilt or resentment.
So running off that in terms of, having that guilt and then building that resentment for that person, how can someone with a people-pleasing personality learn to be more assertive without sort of sacrificing that positive trait? Because we've spoken about how there can be that selfless side that, is great, and being able to have that empathy and being there for people. Well, that's a wonderful thing, and we love that. But how can someone sort of learn to put in those boundaries to help themselves so that they don't get to that point where they've got that insane buildup of guilt that leads to resentment?
Yeah, I guess, someone with that people-pleasing personality, we're saying they may associate those traits with being their most positive traits, as part of that process of learning. That we might say their most positive traits are probably associated with them being a true version of themselves, which is kind of a different way to look at that. Being able to communicate boundaries in a way that doesn't necessarily call for compensatory parts to kind of get involved as much.
Okay, what does that mean?
Okay, so resentment is one. It's because we've developed one part that counteracts another part that's experiencing a lot of guilt. That's not true of everyone, of course, because some people, that mechanism might not kick in like that. They may go to more of a burnout space and feel like there might be a self-critical kind of aspect to that. Why can't I do that? And beating themselves up, for example. And sometimes that activates a pattern that was already there. But those compensatory parts can include, withdrawing, maybe keeping other people at a distance. It can be having to generate a bit of anger to sort of help counteract the part that always wants to be there for others, those sorts of parts. So if we become sort of aware of those different parts of us and how they're working internally, I guess the goal is that we are able to communicate how we feel and what we need, whilst staying kind of closer to the true version of ourselves. It's being able to express what we need and to say no without having to feel really angry or ashamed.
Yeah, of course.
The ultimate goal.
what would you say should be sort of like the first step for someone who wants to do this but is struggling to kind of do it in a healthy way that works for them? What would you recommend sort of just be their first little step in trying to achieve this?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's sort of trajectory is different and their contexts are different and relationships are different. It can be, for that reason, it can be good to talk to somebody about that, like a therapist who's able to help organize that and maybe explore it. Because like a broad brush approach to this type of area could be problematic. Could have us becoming more defensive or closing people out or overgeneralizing, for example. And there are some circumstances that people might be in where putting in better boundaries for themselves and saying no, that the relationships around them, they might not withstand that.
Yeah.
There might be sort of consequences in the relationship that they may experience. So it can be that we can't assume that the people around or the person around that person we're dealing with or working with, they might not have empathy for them in a true sense. An example, like if we're talking to if we have a manager at work, for example, keeps loading on work and changing our role and to be able to express how we feel because of that and being reliant on that person to empathize, that might not always be available. So, do you know what I'm saying? So it's complicated, and it's the first thing can be to kind of look at it with somebody else, I would say. And so, there's one thing to maybe avoid a very broad or general approach, and to look at your own development and where those things come from and how they might play out in your life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for answering those questions. We really appreciate it. So we're going to go into the practice, habit, experiment, debrief section of the show now. So this is where we ask the experts what they do, what is their personal practice when it comes to the topic. So Ben, what is a practice that you do to build your boundary management skills?
One of those, I guess it's like an approach to the sort of area internally. So one of those things is the first part really is to be able to detect that something doesn't quite feel right, or that there's something that feels like a bit of a strain, or so that requires sort of a certain attunement to yourself emotionally, I guess. Initially, I guess it's like a broad look. Sometimes, sometimes someone might ask us for some time, or they want to talk about something that's going on for them, and we might say, I don't feel like doing this. And there might be part of us that really wants to sort of push them away, feels critical about the person. So that's one example of like taking a step back about what's been activated, because we might discover that actually, like last week, that might not have felt the same, but this week, because I'm so busy and stressed out, that's a factor here that's getting involved. So I'm going to look at like the outside factors that might be contributing to how we respond.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying.
Another party's looking at what stories might be activated in it. Like there might be certain generalizations or narratives about people or ourselves that are being activated in that. Nobody's there for me, or this person, whatever those sorts of stories are, to be able to detect that as well and to check, is this actually what's going on here? Or could it be something else?
Yeah. Well, that requires you to know yourself quite well.
Yeah, well, that works. Always a work in progress, right? For all of us.
Exactly. Yeah. So what would you say are some challenges that you face when sort of being able to recognize those different facets of your feelings and where they're coming from, what would you say are some challenges that you face when sort of trying to understand your feelings in relation to boundaries?
Well, the challenges can be for our empathetic parts, right? Like as we touched on before. Being able to, I had a plumber over a couple of weeks ago to install a new fridge, and he needed a different part that he didn't have, like to connect the plumbing to the wall. And he said, and he was someone, we were paying to come in to install a fridge, of course. And he said, "Oh, can you go to the hardware store and pick up that piece for me?" And so, like, in very, very quickly, what can happen is, I detecting, like, an empathetic part is, I feel for him because he probably has to drive around all day, and I don't have to do that. So part of me is like, I could do that because, I kind of feel for him if he doesn't want to do that. Another part of me might be this sort of a thread that might lead to something that's more about anger, like, I'm paying you to do this, blah, blah, blah. Why, this is your job to do that. So to detect those different parts that are getting involved in the process, knowing sort of how they're working internally and being able to sort of stay within the self and say, that's part of your job, so you're going to have to do that. And even sort of smiling as that's happening. There are risks about it because you don't really know how the other person is going to respond. But in that process, it's also to recognize that it's not my job to always manage the other person's feelings about what's happening.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting. Oh, it's so hard when I think about that. I'm like, oh, like that just like that in itself just made me go like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I do. But yeah, okay. So how often do you find yourself having to do that?
I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I am perfect at this type of thing either, which is a problem. Like these things are always something that's a negotiation and exploration in us, all of us.
Yeah.
It's something I think to be able to stay in yourself and express what you need and to be able to say no. That's something I guess I try to do, but it doesn't mean it's always perfect. Sometimes you might catch yourself feeling a certain way about someone or a situation, and that cracks out, and that's how you find out that process has been running in the background. Do you know what I mean? Or a certain feeling about a situation. But like even when you think about those situations, Tia, you can detect probably different parts that might be activated by that scenario.
Yeah, of course.
And I guess that's definitely the whole process, is really about being able to identify those things.
Yeah, interesting. So how do you think this practice impacts your personal resilience?
Personal resilience, I guess it can mean in some level that the relationships around us can feel fairly genuine.
Yeah.
So that in itself is to have relationships that feel that way. They're incredibly important in terms of resilience. Like it's a support network that's not always family. Like a lot of people, they don't have that in their family system, and they have that outside of the family system, but those reflections back can inform a sense of self that's really quite positive and rational, and that forms the basis of resilience too.
Yeah.
So if we don't have good boundaries, we spend a lot of time wondering about how we might cope, how we're going to engage in this interaction, thinking about interactions in the past or that sort of content area from the past.
Yeah, definitely.
Which can be very, very stressful. And that affects our resilience because it takes up a lot of time and energy.
exactly what I was going to say. Yeah. So would you recommend sort of this practice, you know, that thought process? Would you recommend this to everyone?
I think in the area of boundaries and resilience, and in many other domains, it's a really important it's an important tool to be able to understand the different parts of us and where they come from. And there are like therapeutic approaches that really focus on that, like internal family systems therapy is one of those. Looking at different parts of us and how they kind of interact and where they came from, their role, their function.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, okay.
It's one of the most respectful kind of approaches in that sense that I've ever encountered, looking at the function of those parts of us in earlier stages in now.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, great. Well, thank you for answering all those questions. So we're in the last part of the show now. So this is the open mic section where the guest has a chance to talk about anything that they are passionate about. It doesn't have to be related to the topic, but it can be. So I'm going to hand it over to Ben. Ben, what do you want to talk about?
I guess like there's a related area, which is really about how our experiences early on sort of shape how we see ourselves and you know, our models of ourselves and relationships and the world generally.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
That area is sort of it's often in the frame of sort of trauma research, but the mechanisms and the parts of the brain and those networks that are studied in the area of trauma, they are the same for all of us in terms of early experiences shaping how we see ourselves in terms of our capacity, different emotions that get attached to ideas about the self, whether the environment that we grew up in really provided for us to develop a sense of self independent of other people.
Yeah, definitely. I'm interested to know your thoughts in terms of like, you know, you hear a lot about obviously how those experiences shape you and, you know, those experiences when you're a child and how they have a very big impact on how you grow up and all that kind of stuff. And you sort of have to, and you can deal with them as you get older. What would you say is like, is there, I don't know, is there a point where a person kind of gets to, I wouldn't say a certain age, but a certain stage of their life where, I don't want to say it's too late, but it's just like, it's such an ingrained part of you that it's like, how would you ever kind of reverse that kind of, you know, that mindset or that system that's been put in place that has never been, you know, like picked out by a therapist? Is there ever a sort of like, is there ever a point where you're like, okay, well, this is something that we're just going to have to manage instead of, work around instead of sort of try and remove?
Can you give me sort of an example of the type of aspect of the person? I mean, I can think of some, but maybe you tell me what you're thinking.
I guess just like, I don't know, maybe just like, I guess, for example, like social anxiety or something like that. Like, is that, like, if that's something that sort of like, you know, you can draw it back to a certain like family situation. Yeah. Like, is there something, is there like,
does it sort of become embedded or concreted in sort of thing?
Yeah, like it's something that's become like concreted in and you're just like, could that ever like realistically change for that person?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes, but there's a little asterisk on that, and it's really about sort of willingness or the likelihood that that person is going to be in the environment that might disrupt the pattern. So the asterisk is the other issue, you know, like how would that happen? But we do know that there are, and on the more extreme ends, for example, like people with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, like people who are in their, like Vietnam veterans, for example, like now in their 70s, like we have research to show that people who've been living with that condition for all of that time can still benefit from treatment and actually kind of heal and find different ways of being through the treatment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Social anxiety is really about it's kind of it has a big component that's about sort of fear conditioning. So and safety behaviors around that sort of the fear. How that kind of works is, if you can imagine, like, you might be like a young child and you were bitten by a neighborhood dog and it was really scary and awful. And you'd never, you've been scared of dogs ever since, and never been anywhere near a dog. So what we might say is that that conditioning sort of stays intact until a person's been able to have some level of exposure and habituation to that. So we might say, well, it might be 20 years later, in the right sort of conditions, that habituation can happen. And it's the same with social anxiety, because the core parties. Core parties about negative impressions of others, and some of that's informed through early experiences and core beliefs about the self. And, there's a number of them. The usual suspects are things like, I'm too boring, I'm too much, or people are going to see me as toxic or crazy, or also dumb is another big one, the classics. And then we help a range of behaviors around that. But if people are going to work on that, they can change that, for example.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So you mentioned before sort of like, if you're in the environment for it, for that, and like, I don't want to go back to boundary management, but in terms of
that's okay,
how much, like, when it comes to sort of, creating boundaries, and if you're trying to like build in an environment where your boundaries are constantly being, compromised, where you're constantly being pushed, like, how much can a person sort of grow in an environment like that before, like, it's too much and they do have to sort of, move on to be able to continue to grow? Like, how much can you sort of like, how much can you work on yourself in a toxic space before the space really has to be departed?
Yeah, I got you. So, I mean, on one end,
and I feel like this ties back into the family thing, like if you've got like your family is your family. They're related to you for the reason that they are. And, like for some people, that's your whole life. For the rest of your life, they are your family. And how do you kind of like grow in an environment where, those people are your family, or, going back to the boundary management thing where your boundaries are constantly being pushed and compromised? How can you sort of be more assertive or grow in those kinds of environments? And how far can that really go?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because like in some environments, if the environment is is abusive, then like there's a spectrum here in that sense. If a relationship and the context around the person is abusive, like it's the relationship itself isn't necessarily gonna something will change. Being able to put boundaries in some environments means that a relationship will stop or drastically change. So the other part you referred to, the idea about being in that and being sort of constantly subject to, those sort of boundary breaches. And in family situations like children, they can't really escape all this, the conceptualization of escaping and not being there. It's really alien, especially if, those environments are what's kind of normal, like for children, often, or there's confusion around what's sort of normal in that sense. So if we've come from that type of environment, it's like the idea about what we will tolerate, and the idea that I'm actually able to affect change in my life. That's something really new and challenging to kind of get one's head around, and it can require support to do that. It's really new.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting. Well, that brings us to the end of open mic, but is there anything that you would like to add to your open mic session before we close?
No, I think we've covered sort of we've covered quite a bit in
quite a fair amount of ground.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Benjamin, for being here. It's been such a pleasure. We've learned so much, which has been wonderful. For those who want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
They can have a look at our practice's website, which is spencerstreetpsychology.com.au. That's our practice website. There's some information about me and my workmates at the practice there.
Great. Awesome. Well, we'll leave the links to all of that stuff for Ben in the description below. But thank you so much, Ben, for being here. It's been really wonderful. And
been excellent to meet you.
We've had a great time. Yeah, it's been really wonderful, and we've had a great time. And to the listeners, thank you so much for listening. Once again, don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks again. You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps others find us and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Tia Harmer. Thanks for tuning in.